So, in this module we are basically going to do a very quick review of what are all the different concepts that we actually talked about in network security, right. So, the network security it is basically a set of principles which will help to put in place certain kind of confidentiality to the type of to the traffic that is actually being sent across in the network. It is a set of principles that will provide a set of authentication mechanisms for either the devices or the users which are trying to participate in a conversation. So, conversation here means the exchange of any kind of data. It is a set of principles that will provide me a message integrity service that we discussed in detail of trying to ensure that the message that is finally received by the destination node or the user is really the one that has been actually sent by the original source. And then it also talks about the different kinds of the key distribution mechanisms that we had discussed, right. So, whether we are actually using a private key or a public key, how is it that it is actually going to be exchanged, especially the public key which has to be exchanged to the other side and intimated to the rest of the users, right. So, then we also had discussed very briefly about the different types of technologies in practice as well as tools. So, we had talked about firewalls and the tools like Wireshark and intrusion detection tool like Snort. So, we will try to do a quick review of them right now. So, what exactly is confidentiality? We talked about it. So, confidentiality is basically a mechanism that my network security should provide, wherein the sender and the intended receiver alone should understand the content that is actually flowing from the sender to the receiver, right. So, how is this achieved? So, sender will encrypt the message and the receiver will be expected to decrypt the message. So, authentication is a mechanism by which the network security should provide me, in which the sender and the receiver should be able to confirm the identity of each other, right. So, the message integrity is basically by a mechanism by which the receiver can be sure that whatever it has received is really the message that the sender has actually tried to send. Along with it, the network security also should provide a way by which the access and availability is guaranteed either to the set of users or to the set of devices as required per my security policy, right. So, as far as the sender and the receiver here, we discussed in detail about how they could be really any kind of an user. So, user here could be an application like a web browser or web server or an email client or an email server. It could be a banking application on your mobile that is running, for example, with your banking web server. It could be a DNS client and DNS server and so on and so forth, right. So, it could be typically any kind of an application that is used. Now, what kind of different things that as part of network security we need to be very aware of. So, we will need to have mechanisms in place to protect against somebody just doing a plain eavesdropping. Somebody might try to actively insert messages giving an impression that they are really authentic users. Somebody might try to impersonate as they are maybe portraying a picture as if they are some other user. Somebody might try to hijack an existing connection session, and somebody might play a dirty trick of trying to do a denial of service attack or do a distributed denial of service attacks. These kind of things we actually discussed in detail. So, coming into the confidentiality part, we talked about a symmetric key cryptography or a public key cryptography. A symmetric key cryptography means that both sides, the sender and the receiver, is going to be actually using the same key for encrypting and decrypting, whereas the public key cryptography essentially means that the sender and the receiver will be using two different keys. The sender will be using what is called as a public key of the receiver. The receiver is expected to use a private key of his own self, which nobody else is expected to know other than him, right. So, thereby since the decryption is protected, the requirement of the confidentiality part of it is also taken care of. So, from a symmetric cryptography, we talked about different kinds of common cryptographic algorithms like DES, AES and triple DES that are actually available. And in the public key cryptography, we talked about a mechanism called as an RSA mechanism, where I will basically be able to use either the private key or the public key on the sending side, and the corresponding key on the receiving side to get back the original message, right. So, that was basically an important property of the RSA protocol mechanism that we discussed in detail, which is essentially the crux of any public key cryptographic mechanism. Then we talked about the different levels of authentication evaluations, right from what kind of limitations are there if a person just says that I am so and so, and then we actually evolved it into subsequent versions, and then finally introduced the concept of a nonce value and the nonce value getting encrypted to finally prove that this kind of a mechanism could be typically made use of for having the other party authenticated before the exchange of data could really happen. So, through this mechanism the authentication requirement of the network security principle could actually be met. So, this was actually discussed in detail, and then we introduced the concept of a digital signature and compared it with how the digital signature could really be compared with a normal handwritten signature, and then sort of make it as part of a verifiable requirement as well as a non forgeable requirement, right. So, the digital signature we explained the working of how a digital signature is implemented at the sending side, how the digital signature is implemented on the receiving side, and how is the concept of a non repudiation is possible to be demonstrated as part of digital signature. So, non repudiation we discussed in detail, wherein the person after sending the message does not claim that he has not sent the message at all in future, right. So, using the digital signature we will be able to prove that it was indeed this person who had actually originally sent the message if required even in a court of law, right. So, essentially the mechanism by which even a third party could verify by the digital signature concept, right. Then we introduced the concept of a message digest where we talked about how different message digest algorithms like MD5, SHA algorithms are available for providing me the data integrity part of it, wherein with the hash function that I generate a fingerprint, I will conclusively prove at the receiving end that the receiver has actually received the message intact without any kind of corruption happening either intentionally or unintentionally as part of the message transit and also as part of the message storage if the message is getting stored on the receiver end, right. So, message digest is basically to generate a fixed length easy to compute fingerprint signature that I could effectively generate on the sending side and then sort of transport it to the receiver and have the receiver run the same algorithm that the sending side has sent on the data that has been received, and the comparison of this fingerprint that has been received on the receiver side would be compared with whatever the sender has also generated and sent. If these two match, that essentially means that there has been no modification of the data. If there is a mismatch, that means essentially there has been some modification of the data in transit, and then we discuss because of this the receiver might just discard the data completely, right. So, then we talked about how a digital certificate is actually useful for extracting the public key which is actually used for the asymmetric key or the public key cryptographic encryption, right. The digital certificate will actually have lot of other details in which the public key will also be part of it, and that is basically what will be used by the client side to generate the public key of the receiver and then use that public key for encrypting the data before sending it to the receiver. Then we started looking at the different kinds of technologies like firewalls, what are the different types of firewalls that are there, what kind of attacks that the firewall device typically tries to protect us from, like DOS attack or any kind of an active attack of illegal modification or any kind of a spoofing attack. We talked about different types of firewalls like a packet filtering. We discussed in detail about how with the packet filtering kind of a firewall I could actually try to filter packets based on the metadata of the packet header. Then we looked at the application gateway type of a firewall where I could actually have a gateway firewall running for each of the applications that I want to protect my network against, right. Then we talked about the different limitations that a firewall and a gateway kind of a device could have, and what could be deployed to overcome that limitations as different types of rules, right. So, we discussed about the IP spoofing, what kind of rules and countermeasures that are typically there for preventing that kind of an IP spoofing kind of an attack and similar other attacks, right. So, once we looked at the different types of attacks, we had a very brief discussion on the secure sockets layer, the SSL part of it, which is actually available as part of my transport layer security, and discuss the kind of services that my SSL provides in terms of doing encryption and decryption at the data level, doing a type of an authentication, and if necessary doing the authentication of the client also in certain specific application requirements. Then we looked at the network level security of the IPsec protocol, and how having IPsec protocol implementation, two different protocols in IPsec, one which is the authentication header, another which is the encapsulation security payload protocol. With these two things, how different network security services are typically deployable at my network layer, right. So, based on these discussions, we had a very brief look at a couple of network security products. Starting with the Wireshark, we looked at very briefly on what kind of features are available in that, how I can make use of, in what kind of requirements, and also we looked at a network intrusion software like Snort, which could be used for trying to identify possible network intrusion detections on my network. So, these are softwares that network administrator would typically try to make use of at a very basic level to understand what kind of attacks are possibly could happen, and also to do some kind of a basic auditing on the network in terms of what kind of traffic is flowing through that, whether originating from outside or originating from inside into the outside network. So, with those two sample applications, we just wanted to give you an idea of what are the different type of network security products that are there, but that is actually just an example set of products that we had introduced, and just to give you an idea. And apart from this, there are more sophisticated products that are actually also available. So, with this basic foundation level discussion on network security, in our subsequent information security courses, when we talk about in detail about the different network security products and tools and configurations, this basic foundation should help you to understand the different kinds of jargons that we will need to discuss and make use of for those discussions. We hope you find this module and this level security course very useful for you. Thanks to all of you for attending this particular information security course. Thank you.